foolish woman! Get out of my house! You deserve to die!
I lay broken at the bottom of the marble staircase, my body twisted in pain, my breath coming out in short, terrified gasps. One hand scraped weakly against the cold floor, slipping again and again, while my other hand clutched my pregnant belly so tightly it hurt, because in that moment, holding my baby felt like the only thing keeping me alive. I tried to scream, but the house was too big, too polished, too silent to care. Above me stood my husband, Daniel Anderson. His arm was still stretched forward, frozen exactly where he had shoved me. His chest rose and fell fast, like his body hadn't yet caught up with what his hands had done. And behind him, just one step back, close enough to enjoy the view, stood Vanessa Cole. Slim, perfectly dressed, smiling, not shocked, not afraid. Smiling like a woman who believed the problem had finally been solved. This wasn't an accident. This was a performance. They thought the fall would end everything. They thought I was too quiet to survive. They thought pregnancy made me weak. They thought no one important would ever ask questions. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine as I lay there bleeding, was that the man rushing through the open doors of that mansion, wearing a black judicial robe and carrying a briefcase, wasn't just another stranger drawn by the chaos. He was Justice William Anderson, newly sworn in, unbribable, unforgiving, and he was my father. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if you believe stories about truth, justice, and dignity deserve to be told, please subscribe. Your support keeps stories like mine alive. My name is Grace Anderson, and until the day my husband tried to kill me to impress his mistress, I believed silence was strength. I used to believe kindness could soften any home. I believed patience was a language everyone eventually understood. I believed if I stayed gentle long enough, love would meet me halfway. That belief shaped the woman I became inside Daniel Anderson's house. Every morning, I woke before dawn, long before the city stirred. The mansion was always quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that felt expensive but lonely. I would lie still for a moment, one hand resting on the gentle curve of my pregnant belly, whispering a silent greeting to the life growing inside me. That was the only part of my day that felt entirely mine. Then I would rise carefully, so I wouldn't wake Daniel, and move through the house like a shadow, opening curtains, wiping counters, starting breakfast, making myself useful before anyone had the chance to complain. I spoke little, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence had become safer. Words were easily twisted in that house. Silence, at least, could not be quoted back at me with contempt. In public, Daniel called me his humble wife. He smiled when he said it, as if humility were a virtue he had generously given me. At charity events and family gatherings, he would rest a hand lightly on my back and tell people how calm I was, how undemanding, how grateful. People nodded approvingly. Women smiled at me with something close to envy. Men praised him for choosing a good woman. No one asked what it cost me to be that good. Behind closed doors, the tone changed. Daniel's patience evaporated the moment the front door shut. My quiet became annoying. My careful movements became slow. My pregnancy, once celebrated, became an inconvenience that disrupted his routines. "Why are you always tired?" he would ask, irritation sharp in his voice. Other women work through pregnancy. When I tried to explain, he waved me off as if my body were exaggerating its own pain. His mother, Margaret Anderson, watched everything with calm, appraising eyes. She praised my obedience openly, but her praise always felt like a leash. "A woman who knows her place brings peace to a home," she liked to say, especially when Daniel was within earshot. But peace, in her language, meant silence. It meant serving without being seen. It meant swallowing discomfort so other people could feel comfortable. She never called me by my name when she was angry. I was that girl, or Daniel's wife, or sometimes simply you. She corrected how I cooked, how I dressed, how I carried myself, even how I breathed, it seemed. When I moved too slowly because of my pregnancy, she clicked her tongue in disapproval. When I rested, she reminded me that women didn't get paid to be weak. The house staff noticed. They learned quickly when to look away. When Daniel snapped at me over nothing. When Margaret scolded me in front of them for imagined mistakes. Their eyes dropped to the floor, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. In that house, compassion was a liability. I told myself endurance was love. I repeated it like a prayer. Love requires patience. Love survives storms. Love doesn't complain. I had been raised to believe that a woman held her family together by absorbing its weight quietly. So I absorbed. I absorbed sharp words. I absorbed loneliness. I absorbed the way Daniel's attention drifted further from me each day, like a tide pulling out to sea. What I didn't realize then was that endurance, when offered to the wrong people, doesn't inspire gratitude. It teaches entitlement. Daniel stopped asking about my doctor appointments. He stopped noticing when I flinched at sudden movements. Sometimes he would look at me with something like annoyance, as if my presence reminded him of responsibilities he no longer wanted. His phone became an extension of his hand. He smiled at messages I never saw. When I asked who was calling so late, he told me I was imagining things. Margaret noticed too, and instead of concern, I saw satisfaction flicker across her face. Men need excitement, she once said casually over breakfast, as if explaining the weather. A woman must learn not to suffocate her husband. I stared down at my plate, my appetite suddenly gone, my hand unconsciously covering my belly. I began to feel like a guest in my own life. I existed to make things run smoothly, not to be considered. My body was changing, my emotions stretching thin, but no one asked how I was coping. And I didn't offer the information. I had learned that vulnerability in that house was ammunition. Some nights, when Daniel came home late, I lay awake listening to his footsteps move through the hallway without coming into the bedroom. I told myself he was tired. I told myself work was stressful. I told myself marriage had seasons. Anything but the truth, because the truth felt too heavy to carry while pregnant. I still believed kindness would be rewarded. That if I stayed calm, stayed gentle, stayed small, things would settle. That belief kept me quiet when alarms were already ringing. It kept me polite when I should have been firm. It kept me trying to fix myself instead of questioning why I was being treated like something disposable. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see then. Silence didn't protect me. It prepared them. It taught them I would endure anything. It taught them I wouldn't fight back. And in a house where power was measured by who spoke the loudest, my quiet became an invitation. That was who I was before the fall. The quiet wife. The patient one. The woman who believed love meant enduring whatever was handed to her. Vanessa Cole didn't enter my life gently. She didn't arrive as a rumor or a suspicion or something I could slowly prepare myself for. She entered like a sudden change in weather, loud, undeniable, and disruptive, though at first, I didn't know her name. I only felt her presence in the way my husband began to change. Daniel started coming home different, not tired in the way work usually made him tired, but restless, energized, distracted. His shoulders no longer slumped when he walked through the door. Sometimes he hummed under his breath. Sometimes he smiled at his phone in a way that made my chest tighten, though I couldn't explain why. When I asked how his day went, his answers were short, careless, as if the real version of his day had already been shared somewhere else. Vanessa worked close to Daniel's business, or at least that was how he explained it. Close enough for lunches that ran long. Close enough for meetings that didn't need offices. Close enough that her name began to appear casually in conversation, dropped like it was nothing. Vanessa said this, or Vanessa thinks that. Always Vanessa. Always spoken with an ease I hadn't heard him use with me in months. I saw her once before I knew who she was. She walked into one of Daniel's events wearing a fitted red dress that demanded attention without asking permission. Her heels clicked confidently across the floor, her laughter ringing louder than necessary, turning heads before she even reached the room center. She looked like a woman who had never learned how to shrink herself and never planned to. When she smiled at Daniel, it was not polite. It was possessive. Later, when I asked who she was, Daniel shrugged. Just someone from work. But the shrug came too fast, too practiced. And when I asked again weeks later, he sighed, irritation flickering across his face. Why are you always reading meaning into everything? That was the first time he accused me of being difficult for simply asking. I didn't know then that while I was choosing my words carefully at home, Vanessa was choosing hers freely somewhere else. When Daniel complained about my quietness, she didn't ask why. She didn't suggest understanding. She laughed. She called it weakness. She told him a man needed energy, not silence. When he mentioned my pregnancy, she didn't congratulate him. She tilted her head and said it sounded like a trap. Responsibility, disguised as love. Her voice became the place Daniel ran to when the weight of his choices pressed too hard against his chest. With her, he didn't have to be patient. He didn't have to be careful. He didn't have to explain himself. She validated every irritation he had ever felt about me. She fed the part of him that resented being needed. Slowly, his phone stopped leaving his hand. He took it to the bathroom. He slept with it face down beside him. When it vibrated, he turned away from me instinctively, like someone shielding a flame from the wind. And when I reached for him at night, his body stayed tense, distant, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. His smile came back. That was the part that hurt the most. It wasn't the late nights or the secretive calls. It was the smile I hadn't seen in a long time, the easy one, the relaxed one. The one he used to give me. Now, it appeared suddenly, without warning, usually while he stared at his phone. And every time I saw it, something inside me folded in on itself quietly. Vanessa never raised her voice to him. She didn't need to. She spoke certainty into his doubts. She told him he deserved more. More admiration. More excitement. More freedom. And each time she said it, Daniel believed it a little more. Believed that his dissatisfaction was my fault. That my calm was a failure. That my pregnancy was an inconvenience I had imposed on him. I felt her influence before I ever heard her say my name. I felt it in the way Daniel sighed when I asked for help. In the way he looked past me instead of at me. In the way Margaret began to make comments that sounded suspiciously rehearsed. Men need women who keep them alive, she said one evening, glancing at me pointedly. Not women who drain them. I started to doubt myself. I wondered if I had changed too much. If pregnancy had made me dull. If my quiet had become something ugly instead of peaceful. I tried to speak more. To smile more. To make myself lighter. But nothing I did reached him anymore. His attention was already being fed somewhere else. Vanessa didn't need to attack me directly. She didn't need to insult me to my face. She did something far more effective. She reframed me in Daniel's mind. She turned my patience into weakness. My loyalty into suffocation. My pregnancy into a chain. And once that picture settled in his head, it became easier for him to justify every sharp word, every cold look, every act of distance. I sensed the danger before I understood it. There were moments, small, unsettling moments, when I felt watched. When I noticed unfamiliar perfume lingering in spaces I hadn't entered. When I saw a woman standing too close at a gathering, her eyes lingering on me with something between curiosity and disdain. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being hormonal. Telling myself I didn't want to become the suspicious wife everyone pitied. But beneath all that denial was fear. A quiet, creeping fear that I was being edged out of my own life. That someone else was rewriting my marriage while I was still trying to save it. Vanessa believed in taking what she wanted. I would learn that later. She believed life rewarded boldness, not patience. Desire, not duty. And as Daniel leaned further into the version of himself she encouraged, I became less of a wife and more of an obstacle, standing silently in the way of a future she had already imagined for herself. I didn't know then how far that belief would take them. I only knew that the storm had arrived, and it was gathering strength. I saw the changes long before I admitted them to myself. They arrived quietly, disguised as normal stress, ordinary distance, things I told myself every marriage went through. But deep down, I knew. I just feared the truth more than I feared being alone. Daniel started coming home later than usual, his excuses delivered casually, as if time itself had shifted to accommodate him. Meetings ran long. Traffic was terrible. Someone needed him urgently. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that kept me awake at night. When he finally came to bed, his body felt absent even when he was physically there, his thoughts still tethered to somewhere or someone else. I noticed the perfume before anything else. It wasn't mine. It was sharper, heavier, clinging to his shirts long after he hung them in the closet. At first, I told myself it must have been from an event or a crowded room. But it appeared too often, too consistently. And each time I inhaled it, my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain without admitting what it might mean. His phone became sacred territory. When I brushed against his hand while he was scrolling, he flinched like I'd touched something forbidden. He tilted the screen away instinctively, then glanced at me with irritation, as if my presence itself were an intrusion. Once, I reached for it absent-mindedly, only to move it aside so I could sit. And he snapped my name sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I tried asking questions gently. I chose my words carefully, softened my tone, approached him like someone trying not to startle a wounded animal. "Are you okay?" I asked once. "You seem far away."
He didn't look at me.
"You're imagining things," he said. Another time, I asked if I'd done something wrong. He sighed loudly and told me I was being emotional. That pregnancy made women dramatic, that I needed to relax. Each dismissal chipped away at my confidence. I began to question my own instincts. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe hormones were making me sensitive. Maybe silence really was better than confrontation. After all, every time I spoke up, something in him hardened. Some nights, I cried quietly in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub with the door locked, my hands pressed to my face to muffle the sound. I cried for the marriage I felt slipping through my fingers. I cried for the baby growing inside me, already surrounded by tension. I cried because I didn't recognize the man I had married anymore, and I didn't know how to bring him back. Margaret heard me once. She didn't knock. She didn't ask what was wrong. She stood outside the door and said calmly, "Don't turn this house into a drama." Her voice carried the kind of authority that didn't invite response. "Men don't like noise," she continued. "If you want peace, you must learn to keep things to yourself."
So I did.
I stopped asking questions. I stopped reaching for Daniel when he pulled away. I stopped mentioning how tired I felt, how scared I was about the pregnancy, how lonely the house had begun to feel. I focused on being pleasant, on keeping my tone even, on not giving anyone a reason to accuse me of causing trouble. I told myself peace would protect my baby. That if I stayed calm, stayed quiet, stayed accommodating, nothing bad could happen. I convinced myself that love meant enduring discomfort without complaint, that a good wife absorbed tension so others didn't have to feel it. But silence has a danger no one warns you about. When you accept too much, people begin to assume you'll accept anything. Daniel began to speak to me more sharply, his patience thinning as if my quietness confirmed his worst thoughts about me. If dinner wasn't ready on time, he snapped. If I moved too slowly because of my swollen feet, he rolled his eyes. He stopped apologizing when he hurt me. He stopped noticing when he did. And somewhere else, far from my careful silence, Vanessa was filling the space I left open. While I swallowed my questions, she fed him certainty. While I tried to keep peace, she encouraged dissatisfaction. While I chose restraint, she praised boldness. I didn't know then how often he spoke to her about me. I didn't hear the way my quietness was mocked, my pregnancy reframed as an inconvenience, my patience labeled weakness. I didn't hear her reassure him that his frustrations were justified, that he wasn't wrong to feel trapped. That wanting more didn't make him a bad man. What I did know was that something in Daniel had shifted from restlessness to resolve. His irritation no longer felt reactive, it felt intentional. He began to look at me not with annoyance, but with calculation. Like someone evaluating a problem instead of seeing a person.
I sensed it in small moments.
The way he watched me walk up the stairs, his eyes lingering not with concern but with something unreadable. The way his jaw tightened when I mentioned my due date. The way he went silent whenever Margaret spoke about inheritance, about legacy, about what belonged to whom. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself fear was just another pregnancy symptom. I clung to the belief that silence was still the safest option, even as my instincts screamed otherwise. I didn't realize then that my silence had stopped being misunderstood. It had been reinterpreted. To Daniel, my quietness meant consent. To Margaret, it meant control. And to Vanessa, though I didn't yet know it, it meant opportunity. While I was busy protecting the peace, they were busy deciding how far they could push me. And somewhere between my restraint and their entitlement, a line was crossed, quietly, deliberately, and without remorse. By the time I sensed real danger, it was already too late to pretend everything was fine. The plans had begun forming in places my silence could no longer reach. The day it happened began like a performance already in motion. The house smelled of expensive perfume and polished wood, the kind of scent meant to impress people who measured worth by shine. Voices drifted up from downstairs. Laughter, compliments, the clink of glasses, too loud, too cheerful, as if joy itself had been hired for the afternoon. I stood at the top of the staircase with one hand resting on my belly, listening as strangers praised my husband for his success, his charm, his generosity. Every kind word landed like a small weight on my chest. Daniel's voice carried clearly through the open space. Confident, animated. He sounded like a man relieved of burdens. When he announced Vanessa as his business partner, the room erupted in applause, the kind reserved for engagements and anniversaries. Someone laughed and said they made a beautiful team. I heard Vanessa's laugh ring out, bright and assured, cutting clean through the noise. For a moment, I wondered if anyone noticed how my name wasn't mentioned. How the baby I carried wasn't acknowledged. How easily I had disappeared. I told myself to breathe. I told myself it was just a lunch. That people clapped for whatever looked good from a distance. I turned away from the railing, intending to go to the bedroom and lie down until the noise settled. My feet were swollen, my back tight. I needed quiet. That was when I heard Daniel behind me. His footsteps were quick, purposeful. Not the distracted shuffle I'd grown used to, but something sharper. He called my name once, low and clipped, like a warning rather than a request. I turned, confused, and saw his face had changed. The smile he'd worn downstairs was gone. In its place was irritation, no, anger, compressed into a tight line across his mouth. "You're embarrassing me," he hissed, keeping his voice low but fierce. The music from downstairs swallowed the edge of it, but I felt every word land. I didn't understand. "I haven't done anything," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. I took a step back instinctively, my hand tightening over my belly. I was just... He moved closer. Too close. His breath smelled like wine, and something else I couldn't place. "You're standing up here like a ghost," he said. "People are asking questions." "What questions?" I asked, genuinely confused. My heart had started to race, an unfamiliar fear crawling up my spine. "I thought you wanted me to rest." His eyes flicked past me, down the staircase, toward the laughter below. Then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt cold against my ear. "One fall ends this." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air, unreal, like something said in a movie. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant. I never got the chance. His hands came forward suddenly, harder than I expected, faster than I could react. They struck my chest with force, a shove that stole my breath and sent my balance spiraling. For a split second, time fractured. I remember the look on his face, Not panic, not regret, but resolve. As if a decision had already been made somewhere far away, and this was simply the execution. The world tilted violently. The railing slid out of reach. The ceiling spun. I felt my feet leave the ground, my body pitching backward into empty space. The marble staircase rushed up to meet me, cold and unforgiving. My scream dissolved into the music below, swallowed whole by celebration. As I fell, instinct took over. My arms flailed uselessly, my mind narrowing to one thought, my baby. I tried to curl inward, to shield my belly, to do something, anything. The impact came in jagged bursts of pain. My back slammed against the steps. My shoulder struck hard. My head snapped to the side. The world became noise and shock and terror all at once. I don't remember every step I hit. I remember the sensation of sliding, the sickening loss of control, the sound of my own breath tearing out of me. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the marble was beautiful up close. I remember the taste of fear, sharp and metallic. Then I was at the bottom. I lay there stunned, my body screaming in places I couldn't name, my lungs struggling to draw in air. One hand scraped weakly against the floor, slipping on polished stone, while the other clutched my belly, as if holding on could keep my child safe inside me. My vision blurred. The ceiling swam above me, the chandelier a distant constellation. Footsteps echoed at the top of the stairs. I looked up, my sight wavering, and saw Daniel standing where he had left me. His arm was still half-raised, as if his body hadn't yet released the memory of the push. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. I searched his face for something, shock, horror, a flicker of remorse. I found none. Behind him, one step back, stood Vanessa. She had followed him upstairs. Or perhaps she had already been there. She stood still, one hand resting lightly on the banister, her red dress immaculate, her expression unreadable. Then her lips curved into a smile, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough. The smile of someone watching a problem resolve itself. The laughter downstairs continued, oblivious. Glasses clinked. Someone cheered again. Life went on, uninterrupted. I tried to speak. I tried to call out. My throat burned, my voice trapped somewhere between pain and disbelief. My body shook uncontrollably. I could feel warmth spreading beneath me, fear tightening around my chest like a vice. In that moment, lying broken at the bottom of my own staircase, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This hadn't been a loss of temper. It hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. Considered. Approved. I closed my eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in instinct, trying to breathe, trying to stay conscious, trying to will myself to hold on. I thought of my baby. I thought of promises whispered in the dark before dawn. I thought of the silence I had believed would keep me safe. Above me, someone finally shouted. Chairs scraped. Footsteps rushed. The music cut off abruptly. Chaos erupted where celebration had been moments before. But for me, time slowed to a crawl. I lay there, pregnant, betrayed, and helpless, with the weight of understanding pressing down harder than the pain. The house that had demanded my silence had decided my fate. And as darkness edged closer, one truth burned through everything else. Silence hadn't protected me. It had brought me here. Light came first, harsh, white, unforgiving. It pressed against my eyelids like a demand. When I finally forced my eyes open, the world was a blur of ceiling tiles and moving shadows, the steady beep of machines slicing through the fog in my head. The air smelled like antiseptic and something metallic.
My throat was dry.
My lips cracked when I tried to speak, and the sound that came out wasn't a word, just a weak breath that trembled. Pain arrived in layers. At first it was distant, like my body was warning me gently. Then it surged all at once, sharp, hot everywhere. My back felt like it had been split open and stitched back together wrong. My shoulder throbbed. My hip burned. Even breathing hurt, each inhale pulling at bruises beneath my skin. I tried to move, and a wave of pain rolled through me so violently, I nearly blacked out again. Instinct snapped through the haze. My baby. My hand jerked toward my belly, trembling. I couldn't feel the familiar roundness the way I expected. Panic rose like a flood. A nurse noticed immediately and leaned over me, her voice soft but urgent, like she was trying to keep me from breaking apart. Easy, sweetheart. Don't move too fast. Baby, I rasped, barely audible. My baby. Her eyes flicked to the monitors, then back to me. She squeezed my hand. You're alive, she said, as if that was the first victory. And we're watching the baby closely. You had a bad fall. Just breathe. A bad fall. Even through the pain, even through the fog, the words felt wrong. I remembered the whisper. One fall ends this. I remembered Daniel's hands hitting my chest. I remembered the moment my feet left the ground. That wasn't gravity. That was intent. I tried to lift my head, but my neck screamed in protest. Another nurse came in, adjusting tubes and checking my vitals with quick, practiced movements. Both women spoke gently, but their eyes carried a tension they couldn't hide.
They weren't relaxed.
They weren't certain. They were monitoring like people waiting to see which way life would tip. How long? I croaked. Hours, one nurse said. You were unconscious. The doctors are doing everything they can. Try not to talk too much. I closed my eyes and breathed through the pain, but my mind refused to rest. Behind my eyelids, I saw the staircase. The marble. Vanessa's smile. Daniel's arms still outstretched, as if he hadn't even tried to pretend. My heart hammered against my ribs, and fear curled tight in my stomach. Not just fear of what I'd survived, but fear of what I hadn't yet escaped. Voices drifted in and out as the day moved around me. Doctors came and went.
Machines were checked.
My blood pressure was read aloud. Someone mentioned internal bruising. Someone mentioned monitoring fetal distress. Each phrase landed like a stone. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to sit up and run. But my body wouldn't cooperate. I was trapped in pain and fear, dependent on strangers with kind hands and serious faces. Then Daniel arrived. I sensed him before I saw him, like my body recognized danger even through medication. The room's energy shifted. A nurse straightened. Someone stepped aside. And then he was there at the foot of my bed, wearing concern like a perfectly tailored suit. His eyes were red, as if he'd been crying. His jaw was tight. His hands shook slightly. To anyone watching, he looked like a devastated husband. He stepped closer, voice low, tender, rehearsed. Grace, oh my God. He swallowed hard, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe it. This was an accident. You slipped. You fell so fast. I tried. I stared at him. The pain in my body was loud, but the rage in my chest was louder. He kept talking, words spilling out too quickly, like he was trying to drown my memory in explanation. The guests, the noise, the stares. Grace, you know how slippery they can be. Please don't scare yourself. Just focus on healing. I couldn't speak. Not properly. But my eyes did. I held his gaze, and I watched something flicker across his face, just for a fraction of a second. Not love. Not fear. Calculation. The faint tightening around his mouth when he realized I was looking at him like I knew. Because I did know. I remembered the whisper. I remembered the push. And the most terrifying part wasn't the fall. It was the understanding that he expected me not to remember. He expected the story he was telling to replace the truth. He leaned closer, reaching as if to touch my hand. My fingers curled reflexively, pulling away. Grace, he said softly, the way a person speaks to someone fragile. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That sentence made my blood run cold. It wasn't comfort. It was a warning. Before I could respond, a doctor entered, interrupting. Daniel stepped back immediately, resuming the role of worried husband. The doctor spoke in careful language about my condition, about risks, about monitoring. Daniel nodded at all the right moments, asked all the right questions. But his eyes kept drifting to the door, to the hallway, to whatever might be coming. And then someone did come, Someone I hadn't expected. A man I recognized only vaguely at first because pain and medication made faces swim. He was tall, dressed neatly, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to walking into rooms where decisions were made. When he spoke to the nurse at the desk outside my room, his tone was polite but firm. He showed an ID. The nurse's posture shifted instantly, her respect obvious. Moments later, he stepped into my room. "Grace," he said gently. My eyes focused, and something in my chest loosened slightly. "Mark," I whispered. Mark was my cousin, my mother's sister's son. We hadn't been close in years, not because of conflict, but because life had pulled us into different lanes. I knew him as the responsible one, the one who always spoke carefully, the one who had gone into law and built a name for himself. Seeing him here felt strange, like a part of my old life had found me in the wreckage of my new one. Mark's eyes moved over me, my bruises, the tubes, the monitors, and his expression tightened in a way that looked like restraint. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He looked at Daniel once, just once, and something silent passed between them. Recognition, assessment, warning. Daniel's face stiffened. "Mark," he said, forcing familiarity. "I didn't know you." Mark didn't smile. "I saw the file," he said calmly. The room went quiet. Mark turned to the doctor, asked a few questions in a tone that carried authority. The doctor answered with a seriousness that made me realize Mark's presence wasn't ordinary. Then Mark looked at the paperwork again, my name, my details, and I saw his eyes widen slightly, just for a moment, like something clicked into place that didn't belong. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to, but his body language changed, subtle but unmistakable. The way he stood straighter, the way he spoke more carefully, the way the nurse suddenly treated me with a different kind of attention, not just medical but protective. Mark stepped closer to my bed and lowered his voice. "Grace," he said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth." My throat tightened. I glanced at Daniel. He was still there, still watching, still wearing concern like armor. The room felt suddenly dangerous. Mark must have noticed, because he nodded slightly toward the nurse. "Could we have a moment?" he asked. The nurse hesitated, then stepped outside and gestured for Daniel to follow. Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm her husband," he protested lightly. Mark's gaze was steady. "And she needs rest. We'll call you if anything changes." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he left, forced by the authority in Mark's tone and the staff's sudden willingness to enforce it. The moment the door shut, my body shook with a silent sob I hadn't allowed myself to release. Mark leaned in, voice gentle. "Did you fall?" he asked. "Or were you pushed?" My heart hammered. The memory flashed behind my eyes. The whisper, the shove, the coldness. I swallowed painfully. "He pushed me," I whispered. Mark didn't react dramatically. He didn't gasp. He just closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming something he'd already feared. Then he opened them, and his calm was different now. It wasn't comfort. It was resolve. "Okay," he said quietly. "Listen to me. You are not alone. And you are not as powerless as they think." I didn't understand what he meant. Not fully. I only knew the room suddenly felt safer with him in it. Mark stepped out into the hallway and made a call. His voice was low, controlled. I caught fragments, names, instructions, urgency. When he returned, there was a new nurse assigned to my door. My chart was moved. My room number was changed. Visitors were suddenly restricted. The staff stopped calling it a fall. They started calling it an incident. Strangers began to treat me like someone important. Not in a glamorous way, not with smiles and flattery, but with caution. Like my situation carried consequences beyond the hospital walls. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why everything was shifting so quickly. My body was broken. My baby was still at risk. My husband was downstairs, telling lies with a straight face. And yet, somehow, the air around me had changed. Mark leaned close again, his voice steady. "Grace," he said, "they may try to come back. They may try to control the story, but we're going to protect you. I swallowed, fear tightening again. Why would they? My voice broke. Why would he do this? Mark's eyes held mine. Because he thought you wouldn't survive, he said softly. And because someone convinced him you were in the way. A cold realization sank into me. This wasn't over. Surviving the fall wasn't the end. It was the beginning of whatever came next. I closed my eyes and breathed carefully through the pain, one hand resting on my belly, praying for the smallest sign of movement. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, Daniel was still smiling for the world, still rehearsing his innocence. But inside me, a different truth had taken root, sharp and undeniable. Someone had wanted me dead, and now that I was still alive, I wasn't sure what they would do next. By the time the invitation arrived, my body was stronger, but my spirit still carried bruises no one could see. Weeks had passed since the fall. Since the hospital, the whispers, the careful way everyone now spoke around me. The doctors said I was healing well, that the baby was still fighting, that every extra day was a victory. Mark kept his promise. I was moved quietly, protected carefully, watched without being smothered. Daniel stopped showing up after the third time security turned him away. Vanessa disappeared completely. Silence settled, but it wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. When Mark told me about the swearing-in ceremony, I almost said no without thinking. The idea of public spaces still made my chest tighten. Crowds felt dangerous. Attention felt sharp. But Mark didn't push. He just said, "You should be there.
Sit quietly.
No one will bother you." Then he paused. It matters.
I didn't ask why.
Somewhere deep down, I already knew. That morning, I dressed slowly, carefully. My movements were still measured, my balance not fully trusted. I chose a simple dress, nothing loud, nothing that would draw eyes. I wanted to disappear into the room, not be seen. Mark picked me up early, his car gliding through the city streets as Lagos woke up around us. Billboards flashed. Radios buzzed with excitement. Every station carried the same headline. A new chief judge. A man known for integrity. A man who refused bribes. A man who terrified corrupt politicians without ever raising his voice. I stared out the window, my hand resting protectively over my belly, feeling a slow, steady movement beneath my palm. My baby kicked, as if reminding me I wasn't walking into this alone. The ceremony hall was grand in a quiet, intimidating way. Marble floors, tall pillars, rows of seats filling quickly with people who mattered, lawmakers, judges, senior advocates, men and women whose names carried weight. Security was tight. The air felt heavy with anticipation and respect. Mark guided me to a seat near the front, not in the spotlight, but close enough that I could see everything clearly. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll be close." I nodded, grateful. As I settled into the chair, I became acutely aware of how small I felt in that room. Not unimportant, just human. Fragile.
Alive.
The murmurs grew louder as more dignitaries arrived. Then suddenly the room shifted. Conversations softened. People straightened in their seats. Heads turned toward the entrance. He walked in without drama. No entourage pushing people aside. No exaggerated confidence. Just a tall man with graying hair, dressed simply, his posture upright, his expression calm. But as soon as his foot crossed the threshold, something extraordinary happened. People stood. Not slowly. Not reluctantly. They rose as if pulled by an invisible string. Judges, politicians, senior lawyers, men who rarely stood for anyone. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor rippled through the hall. The respect was immediate and unquestioned. My breath caught. I hadn't seen my father in years. Not properly. Not like this. To the world, he had been dismissed as insignificant.
A quiet man.
A village schoolteacher. A stubborn moralist who never made it. Daniel had laughed when I spoke about him, calling him irrelevant, outdated, someone who didn't understand how power worked. Even I, at times, had wondered if I'd imagined his importance as a child, if my memories had been shaped more by longing than reality. But as I watched him walk down that aisle, powerful people stepping aside for him, my chest tightened with something dangerously close to awe.
This was not a small man.
This was not a forgotten man. This was a man who had been watching, waiting, building, enduring, just like me. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't smile for the cameras. He acknowledged greetings with small nods, brief handshakes, nothing wasted. When he reached the front, he paused, then turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room. And then they found me. For a split second, the world narrowed to just us. His eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition. His expression softened, just barely, before he masked it with composure. But I saw it. I felt it. The connection snapped into place like it had never been broken. My vision blurred. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd buried along with the anger and distance between us. I hadn't realized how deeply I'd missed him until that moment. I pressed my lips together, steadying my breath, one hand tightening around the edge of the seat. I didn't wave. I didn't stand. I stayed exactly where I was, just as Mark had instructed. Hidden in plain sight. The ceremony began. Speeches filled the air. Words about justice, integrity, responsibility. About a legal system that must protect the vulnerable and punish abuse of power. Each sentence felt heavier than the last, like it was being spoken directly into my bones. When my father raised his hand to take the oath, the room fell completely silent. "I swear," he said, his voice calm and firm, "to uphold the law without fear or favor." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. Without fear. Without favor. Daniel's voice echoed in my memory, mocking. Imagine sharing a surname with that man. I almost laughed out loud. Across the city, Daniel was probably watching the same broadcast, sitting beside Vanessa, making jokes he thought were harmless. He had no idea. No idea that the man he dismissed, the bloodline he tried to erase, now held the highest gavel in the land. No idea that I was there. No idea that the ground beneath his carefully built lies had already started to crack. When the ceremony ended, people surged forward, eager to greet the new chief judge. Mark touched my arm gently. "Wait," he murmured. "Give it a moment." I stayed seated as the crowd shifted, my heart pounding harder with each second. Then my father turned slightly, his gaze finding me again. This time, he didn't look away. He stepped toward me. People noticed immediately. Conversations paused. Heads turned as he approached a quiet woman sitting near the front, her hand resting protectively on her belly. He stopped in front of me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached out, not as a judge, not as a powerful man, but as a father. His hand hovered briefly, as if asking permission, before settling gently over mine. "You came," he said softly. I nodded, tears spilling freely now. I didn't know if I should. "You should," he replied. His eyes flicked briefly to my stomach, then back to my face. "I've been waiting." In that moment, something inside me settled. The shame I'd carried, the doubt, the belief that I was truly alone. It all loosened its grip. Around us, people watched quietly, sensing that this wasn't just politics. This was something deeper. Mark stepped closer, nodding respectfully to my father. They exchanged a look, understanding, coordination, trust. As we walked out together, I felt taller somehow. Not stronger in my body, not healed completely, but anchored. Daniel had believed power came from money, from noise, from control. He had been wrong. Power had been walking quietly beside me all along. And now, it had finally stepped into the light. While they told people my survival was luck, truth was assembling itself quietly, patiently, like a storm that doesn't announce its arrival until it has already darkened the sky. I was still learning how to walk without flinching, how to sleep without jolting awake, how to breathe without checking exits, when Mark told me something important. I didn't need to prove anything. I only needed to stay alive long enough for the truth to finish its work. Kunnel and Saad didn't hide very well after the fall. They didn't think they had to. From what I later learned, they celebrated softly. Private dinners, whispered jokes, small smiles exchanged over wine. They called what happened to me bad luck. They told anyone who asked that I'd always been clumsy, emotional, dramatic. Saad even joked once that pregnancy made women unstable, that accidents were bound to happen. She said it with a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. But lies have a weakness. They require too many people to cooperate. The first crack came from the hospital. A doctor, one Mama Janet had personally thanked after my fall, began to unravel under pressure. It wasn't fear of punishment at first. It was fear of exposure. The medical reports didn't align. Timelines shifted. Injuries told a different story than the one written neatly on paper. When questioned again, gently but firmly, he panicked. The truth spilled out in pieces, hesitations, half-sentences, admissions wrapped in excuses. He hadn't meant to falsify anything, he said. He'd only wanted to help an influential family.
He hadn't known a child was involved.
He hadn't known how serious it was. They never know how serious it is until it's too late. Around the same time, something unexpected surfaced from Sada's side. She had always believed she was the smartest person in the room. That confidence made her careless. She talked too much. She recorded everything. Voice notes sent late at night, dripping with mockery and cruelty, sent to someone she trusted until jealousy turned that trust into betrayal. One message stood out. One push and she's gone, Sada's voice said lightly, almost bored. Then everything is finally ours. The woman who received that message didn't come forward immediately. She listened. She watched the news. She saw my face, pale but alive. And something shifted. Guilt, fear, maybe self-preservation, whatever it was, it made her save the files instead of deleting them. When investigators asked questions later, she didn't lie. She handed over everything. Connell's mistake was paperwork. Men like him believe violence leaves no paper trail. They forget that greed loves documentation. Days before my fall, he had updated his insurance policies. New signatures. New beneficiaries. Everything pointed in one direction, him. It was framed as preparation for the baby, responsible planning, a loving husband securing the future. But timing matters. And when timing is wrong, documents stop protecting you. The final piece came from the house itself. Security cameras don't capture intent, but they capture movement. One camera near the stairwell caught something Connell couldn't explain away. It showed him following me upstairs quickly, his posture tense, his jaw tight. It showed me backing away. It showed him lunging forward, then nothing but empty space where I had been moments before.
No audio.
No drama. Just motion. I didn't watch the footage when they showed it to me. I didn't need to. I had lived it. What struck me most through all of it wasn't the cruelty. I already understood that. It was how quietly the truth moved.
No shouting.
No public confrontations.
No emotional speeches.
Just facts stacking on top of facts, each one adding weight until denial collapsed under it. I stayed quiet, not out of fear this time, but out of resolve. I answered questions when asked. I rested when told. I focused on my breathing, my healing, the steady rhythm of life inside me. Every kick from my baby felt like a reminder that survival was not passive. It was active resistance. Connell didn't notice the storm gathering. Saad didn't sense the shift. Mama Janet still made calls, still tried to smooth things over, still believed influence could erase consequences. They laughed. They relaxed. They thought time was on their side. It wasn't. Evidence doesn't shout. It waits. And I had learned something important through pain and patience. I didn't need to be loud to be believed. I only needed to remain standing long enough for the truth to speak for itself. By the time they realized that, it was already too late. The courthouse felt nothing like the movies. There were no dramatic echoes, no theatrical pauses. Just bright lights that made everything look too exposed, too honest. The air was cold enough to sting, and the silence had a weight to it, like the building itself was trained to listen without reacting. I walked in slowly, not because I wanted to appear fragile, but because my body still demanded respect after what it had survived. My baby shifted inside me as if sensing the tension, and I pressed my palm lightly against my stomach, grounding myself in that familiar movement. Mark walked on my left, steady and calm. My father walked a step ahead, not guiding me like a powerful man escorting his daughter, but like a father shielding her from a world that suddenly felt eager to stare. And they did stare. I felt eyes follow me as I entered the courtroom. Some were curious. Some were sympathetic. Some were hungry for drama. But I had already lived the drama. I didn't come to perform. I came to finish what the truth had started.
Connell was already there.
He sat at the defense table in a crisp suit that tried to convince the world he was still the same respectable man who hosted lavish lunches and shook hands with important people. He looked polished, composed, until his eyes flicked up and landed on me. The smile he had been wearing, the small confident curve he'd practiced for weeks, faltered for a second. His gaze darted quickly away, as if looking at me too long might expose something he couldn't explain. Saad sat behind him. Her lipstick was perfect. Her hair was flawless. Her posture was stiff, controlled, like a woman trying to hold herself together through sheer will. But her hands told the truth her face refused to show. They trembled slightly in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening as if she was fighting the urge to wipe sweat from her palms. Mama Janet wasn't smiling. She sat with her chin lifted, eyes hard, expression fixed in that familiar look of offended superiority. As if she was the one being wronged by my presence. As if the world was being unfair by refusing to forget what had happened on her staircase. I didn't look away from any of them. I took my seat near the front, just where Mark had instructed, and breathed slowly. The walls felt too white, too clean for something this ugly. It struck me then that courtrooms didn't exist to soothe anyone. They existed to strip stories down to facts and force people to face the parts of themselves they'd hoped would stay hidden. The proceedings began with small formalities, names, dates, charges read aloud in a voice that didn't soften for anyone. Attempted murder. Conspiracy. Tampering with evidence. The words sounded unreal even though they described my reality. My skin prickled as each charge landed in the room like a stone. Connell's lawyer stood and spoke first, weaving his narrative carefully.
Accident.
Tragic misstep. Pregnancy hormones. Emotional instability. He framed me like a woman who couldn't be trusted with her own memory. I watched Connell's face as his lawyer spoke. He nodded slightly at the right moments, his expression arranged into concern. And for a moment, if I didn't know the whisper, if I didn't remember the shove, if I didn't still feel the phantom shock of air stealing my balance, I might have doubted myself. That was the point. Mark leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "Just breathe. Let them talk. Facts don't panic." Then the prosecutor began. This voice was different, measured, calm, relentless. No shouting, no dramatics, just an orderly chain of truth. The timeline. The security footage showing Connell rushing after me. The insurance forms updated days before. The hospital report inconsistencies. The doctor's eventual admission that he'd been pressured. Saada's voice note played aloud, filling the room with a cruelty so casual it made my stomach twist. One push and she's gone. The courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. Silence deepened, and I felt the air shift the way it does right before rain. Connell's jaw tightened. Saada's face drained of color. Mama Janet's eyes flicked rapidly, calculating exits that didn't exist. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the entrance of the chief judge. When the court clerk called the name, the room moved like one body. People stood. Respect rose automatically, even from those who didn't want to offer it. I stayed seated for a beat, my chest tight, my throat burning with something I refused to let become tears. Justice Adebayo presiding.
Connell smirked.
It was small, almost instinctive, like a man still clinging to confidence. He leaned slightly toward Saad, as if to share a private joke. I could almost hear the words he'd said before, laughing at the surname as if it meant nothing. Then my father entered. He walked in with the same quiet authority I'd seen at the swearing-in.
No arrogance. No showmanship.
Just presence. The kind that didn't beg for attention, but commanded it anyway. He took a seat at the front, and for a heartbeat, The entire courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Connell's smirk faltered. His eyes sharpened with recognition, then confusion. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to place the face.
He knew the name.
He'd mocked it, but he had never expected the name to be connected to me. The prosecutor requested a brief procedural matter. My father listened, expression unreadable. Then he did something Connell clearly hadn't anticipated. He recused himself. Not quietly. Not as a favor.
Publicly. Clearly.
He stated, with calm precision, that due to a conflict of interest, his relationship to the victim, he would not preside over the matter. He announced a panel of judges he personally trained would hear the case instead, and he emphasized the importance of fairness, transparency, and lawful procedure. It was the kind of move only a man with real integrity makes because it didn't rely on power. It relied on principle. But for Connell, it was worse than my father staying. Because recusal meant there was no way to call it favoritism. No way to claim bias. No way to paint the outcome as family influence. It meant the evidence would stand alone, and evidence has no emotion to manipulate. I watched Connell's face as the words sank in. His confidence didn't collapse dramatically. It cracked. Slowly. The way glass cracks when pressure has been building for too long. Then, my name was called. My legs felt heavy as I stood. I could feel every eye again. But this time I didn't flinch. I walked to the witness stand carefully, placing one hand on the edge of it for balance. The oath was administered, and my voice sounded steadier than I expected when I answered. Yes. I looked forward, not at Connell, not at Saad, but at the panel. I reminded myself that this was not about revenge. It was about record. It was about truth being written down where lies couldn't erase it later. The prosecutor asked me to describe the day of the incident. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I spoke the way someone speaks when they've cried all their tears already. I described the lunch, the noise, the way the house smelled like perfume and applause. I described going upstairs to breathe. I described Connell following me, his voice low, his words sharp. And then I said it. He whispered it would end with one fall. The sentence left my mouth calmly, almost softly. But it landed like a hammer. Connell's head snapped up. For the first time in the courtroom, he looked directly at me. His eyes widened just slightly, as if he couldn't believe I'd remembered. As if he couldn't believe I'd survived with my memory intact. His lips parted, then closed again, and I saw it. The fear he'd been holding back finally rising. Sada's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around a tissue she hadn't even realized she was holding. The defense attorney stood quickly, objecting, but the panel allowed the testimony. They had already heard the voice note. They had already seen the footage. They had already read the insurance documents. My words didn't create the crack. They simply widened it enough for everyone to see inside. The defense tried to shake me. Asked if I was sure. Asked if I might have misheard. Asked if pregnancy trauma could distort memory. I answered simply. I know what I heard. I know what I felt. He pushed me. My voice didn't tremble. Because the truth doesn't require decoration. When I stepped down from the stand, my legs felt weak, but my mind felt clear. I returned to my seat and rested my hand on my belly again, feeling my baby move like a quiet confirmation. Connell sat very still, staring at the table in front of him like it might offer escape. Saad kept her eyes forward, but her face looked tight, strained, as if she was holding back panic. Mama Janet's expression had changed from superiority to calculation, her gaze darting around the courtroom like a woman trying to find a loophole in a wall. But there were no loopholes left. Because in that bright, cold courtroom, with integrity and evidence standing side by side, Connell's lies didn't just sound weak. They sounded finished. I wish I could tell you that the moment I stepped down from that witness stand, everything ended cleanly and quietly. That justice fell instantly. That people accepted the truth without resistance. But real life doesn't resolve that neatly. What happened next was slower, heavier, and far more revealing than anyone expected. Because when lies begin to collapse, the people who built their lives on them don't fall silently. They fight. They bargain. They betray each other. And the courtroom you just saw was only the beginning. In part 2, you'll see what happened after the evidence spoke. How fear turned allies into enemies. How desperation exposed secrets no one planned to share. And how power reacts when it realizes it can't escape accountability. You'll see who tried to rewrite the story, who tried to disappear, and who finally turned on the very people they once protected. You'll also see what justice really looks like when it moves beyond the courtroom, how it reaches bank accounts, reputations, family legacies, and the quiet moments no cameras ever capture. And you'll see the choice I had to make as a woman, a mother, and a daughter when punishment was no longer enough. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think silence ever truly protects someone, or does it only protect abusers? If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet as long as I did, or spoken up sooner? And most importantly, do you believe people reveal their true character when they think no one important is watching? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. If this story moved you, if it made you uncomfortable in the right way, or if it reminded you that truth has weight even when whispered, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Because what happens next changes